Hello guys, this is our channel LNC Pro. Welcome to the channel. Today's topic is separation of powers. I'm Ratnesh Parikh and this topic is very important for constitutional law and administrative law both. So let's start. Separation of powers. This doctrine is based on the principle of trias politica. This term was coined by Montesquieu in the 18th century. So let's understand what does trias politica says. According to this principle, there are three kinds of governmental organs and the power needs to be divided between these three organs. Organs are legislative, executive, and judiciary. This doctrine this doctrine was propounded by John Locke in 16th century and then it was developed by Montesquieu. According to Montesquieu, power corrupts and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely and this is why powers need to be divided. Now let's see what does Montesquieu says. Montesquieu theory. According to him, there are three kinds of powers: legislative powers, executive powers, and judicial powers. So he says that these powers should not be given in the hand of one man or in the hand of one body. No matter how honest that man or body is, if the powers are given in the one hand, there will be arbitrariness. This principle basically works on three rules. First rule is the same person should not form part of more than one of the three organs of the government. Now, it says that a person who is a member of legislature should not be a member of judiciary also. For instance, if legislature brings an act that is violative of our fundamental rights, we can claim for the remedies and we can go to the judiciary. But if both the powers are given to the same person, we cannot have fair discharge of justice. Second principle is one organ of the government should not interfere with any other organ of the government. Here, judiciary cannot interfere with the work of legislature or executive, or the legislature cannot interfere with the work of executive or judiciary because they have to work within the spheres of powers given to them by constitution. Now, third principle is one organ of the government should not exercise the functions assigned to any other organ. This is function of legislature to bring acts, bring laws, and it cannot be done by the judiciary. And the function of judiciary is to try cases, and that should not be done by the legislature. These are the three rules on which the doctrine of separation of power works. Now, let's see why this doctrine is important. Importance of this doctrine. First of all, this doctrine is accepted by very few countries in the world because this doctrine is very rigid in its true sense and it cannot be applied easily. According to this doctrine, there shall be a government of law rather than will and whims of the official, and this is very important for any democracy. Secondly, this doctrine provides for independence of judiciary. This is also an important feature in Indian Constitution or US Constitution, and this is also an important part. In 1789, Constituent Assembly of France was of the view that there would be nothing like a constitution if there is no doctrine of separation of power in that constitution. Thus, we can say that this doctrine is very important because it provides for independence of judiciary and it gives a fair and proper discharge of justice. Everything has certain defects and so does this doctrine. Let's see the defects in this doctrine. Though theoretically this doctrine sounds very good, but when it was sought to be applied in real life situation, it faced a lot of difficulties. This doctrine is based on the assumption that three functions of the government are independent from each other, but in reality, they cannot be completely separated. Once Justice Frank further said, enforcement of a rigid concept like separation of power would make functioning of modern government impossible. Why? For instance, if the legislature can only legislate, then it cannot punish anyone for committing breach of its privileges. Every parliament has certain privileges and so does Indian parliament. For example, Indian parliament have the privilege of punishing anyone who misreports the speeches given by its members in the houses. and if anyone misreports those speeches, the legislature can punish it. But this is the function of judiciary and it is performed by the legislature. So if this doctrine is applied very rigidly, this function will not be done. And second example, the courts cannot frame rules of procedure to be adopted by them for the disposal of cases. In India, every High Court and Supreme Court have their own regulations for the disposal of cases, which is the function of legislature, framing the laws. And if it is the case, it cannot be done by the judiciary. Now let's see separation of powers in USA. This doctrine is the foundation of US Constitution. According to Article 1 of US Constitution, all the legislative powers are given to the Congress. Article 2 gives all the executive powers to the President. And Article 3 that gives all the judicial powers in the Supreme Court and in the High Court or other subordinate court of the country. There is presidential form of government and it is based on the theory that there should be separation of powers in executive and legislature. This doctrine is not applicable in US in a rigid sense. This doctrine is not applicable in US in its true sense because a bill passed by the parliament or a bill passed by the Congress may be vetoed by the president. And judiciary can also interfere in the powers of the Congress or in the powers of the president. So we can say USA, the true sense of separation of power does not exist. Now let's see separation of powers in UK. Now, as we all know, there are three kinds of governmental powers: executive powers, legislative powers, and judicial powers. Executive in UK consists of the Crown and the government, including the PM and the cabinet. Legislative powers are given to the Parliament, and judicial powers are given to the judiciary. Now, Parliament consists of three things in UK: monarch, House of Lords, and House of Commons. These three things form the Parliament. Now, the government is mainly elected from the parliament. Members of the parliament are part of the government. Government has executive powers and the parliament has the legislative powers. So there is personal overlapping. Second, the monarch has only nominal powers and has to listen to the advice of the prime minister. Monarch is part of the legislature and the prime minister is part of the executive. So there is no separation of powers in UK. Now let's see separation of powers in India. This doctrine is not recognized by Indian Constitution. But Article 50 gives or talks about the independence of judiciary. In India, there is not only functional overlapping, but there is personal overlapping also. Actions taken by executive and laws passed by the legislature can be declared void by the Supreme Court. Now, let's see the important cases in this doctrine in India about this doctrine. So, first case is very famous, the Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narain. We all know about this case. So, in this case, Justice Ray observed that in Indian Constitution there is separation of powers, but in broad sense only. So, they accepted the existence of this doctrine in US Constitution. Next case is Keshvananda Bharti case, the very famous case. So in this case, Justice Begg said that separation of powers is a part of the basic structure of the Constitution of India. None of the organs can take over the functions assigned to the